These were the words of Genghis Khan to his literally captive audience of nobles assembled before him at the great mosque of Bukhara. He is only known to have entered a city once in his entire life, in only one building, and it was here, and it was to harangue the rich and mighty of the old settled lands before ordering them to hand over their earthly treasures. The first Mongol Empire was founded in 1206 AD, when the half-starved steppe orphan Temujin was enthroned as Genghis Khan, and the Bukhara speech was a sort of statement of principles. Khan had cut an empire out of the heart of Central Asia, and he had to do it with almost nothing, and with the powerful out to get him at every turn. This speech must have been cathartic for him. You see, just a week ago, none of those nobles even expected to be there. There were reports of Mongol raids in border regions of the Khwarezmid Empire. The great city of Bukhara itself was known to be as safe as ever. The main trade routes were safe, and the Kizilkum to the east was an uninhabitable waste that the caravans avoided. Only an army of madmen would hike 2,000 miles directly from Mongolia, across mountains, across the Kizilkum, without siege equipment, just to catch Bukhara by surprise. But Genghis Khan was just such a madman. He had sent scouts ahead to befriend nomads from the Kizilkum, who showed him the routes through the desert and oases to quench the thirst of his armies. He sent his other troops to attack the border cities so that the region's reserves would have been summoned forward, leaving Bukhara exposed. He accepted the submission of outlying towns and cities gracefully, while utterly destroying all who resisted. Refugees fled to Bukhara to eat up siege grain and tell stories of the Mongol terror. The common people of Bukhara now wanted to surrender to the Mongols. The Khwarezmid garrison themselves melted away out of fear, being cut down almost recreationally by Mongols in pursuit. The city submitted to the Mongols while a fragment of the garrison holed up in the central fortress, and so Genghis Khan entered the mosque to speak new truth to old power. The Mongols were remembered by history as mindless butchers, but Genghis Khan was illiterate, and only later did his successors embrace writing their memoirs. The only history they wrote from their perspective was literally once a state secret. Their own prime ministers could not read it directly unless they were Mongol, but had to summon a Mongol to read it out loud to them. We've had knowledge of it for a century, and it's been an English translation for a better part of it. It's called The Secret History of the Mongols, and it kicked off an argument in academia around how progressive they were. Progress is a nebulous Western concept that assumes history must get better. The Mongols viewed history as endless, never-changing, like the steppe or the blue sky. But they had a notion of the same idea. When they enthroned a new Khan, they chanted, "May the realm be blessed by your being Khan." We can ask that ourselves. Were the realms of the Mongols blessed by there being Khans over them? Were the realms of the Mongols blessed by there being Khans over them? That is a question of comparative development, which in turn is a question about institutions. Would China, Russia, Central Asia, and Iran have had better, more open institutions without the Mongols? Or did the Mongols bring better institutions in their bloody wake? To look at that, we need to look at those institutions and also how they developed. Part of why this question of how to interpret Mongol history is so contentious is that the Mongols were highly effective propagandists. They rampaged across Eurasia with a small army of archer cavalry, which had little experience with siege warfare. They therefore had a strong interest in encouraging the peaceful surrender of cities with a minimal loss of life. Therefore, every time they did enter a city by storm, everyone not of immediate use to them was slaughtered graphically. Some of the people spared were useful because they were priests, merchants, or artisans. Some were useful as military engineering battalions that would be driven at sword point against the next city. Some were useful because they would flee to the next city, clog the roads of the enemy, and eat his grain. Some were just useful because they witnessed terrible atrocities and lived to tell the rest in graphic detail. The Mongols encouraged people to tell these tales so their enemies might fear them and submit. Jack Weatherford is an excellent writer and historian who takes a pro-Mongol outlook on this issue. He claims in his book Genghis Khan and the Making of the Modern World that the undisputable crimes of Timur were anachronistically attributed to Genghis Khan too. Even if we take this claim on its face, the mere fact that the Mongols pretended to be stone-cold genocidal killers would have been enough to goad them into it if they weren't already. The Stanford Prison Experiment is a famous study where college students were assigned the role of prison guards or prisoners to play. It was canceled early when the students pretending to be prison guards became violent and abusive. The human mind wants to be whole and cannot be long separate. If you claim an identity, it's going to be your real identity. So if you brag about committing genocide as a front, sooner or later it won't be a front. There are other corroborating pieces of circumstantial evidence that the Mongols really did kill as many people as they claimed to. James Waller, in his book Becoming Evil, lays out several psychological factors in genocide, and it reads like a description of steppe culture. Perpetrators of genocide are alcoholic at much higher rates than the general population. So are the Mongols. Survivors of genocide are far likelier to perpetrate genocide. And the Mongols, they survived centuries of Chinese steppe foreign policy. Survivors of polygamy and child abuse due to the breakdown of familial ties are far likelier to perpetrate genocide, and the Mongols had both in spades. People who do their killing at a distance are likelier to perpetrate genocide, and the Mongols had recurved composite bows with the furthest range in their world. People who believe in destiny are likelier to commit genocide, and the Mongols did believe in destiny too. Therefore, it seems reasonable to conclude that the Mongols did commit genocide when and where they could, anytime it furthered their military objectives. This is not the only time historians have debated among themselves about the body count of the Eurasian political system in the wake of propaganda from all sides, but when history rhymes, it usually means the same institutions are involved. But that's a story for a different day, Mr. Chugashvili. There are a lot of biographies of the man first named Temujin and then named Genghis Khan, and if you want to know more, the guys at Extra Credits History put together a good series on him that I'll link in the description. By the way, that is in fact Genghis Khan with a hard G, because he was the original hard G. Bad jokes aside, in other languages his name often starts with a CH or a J, but his name came to French and then English using a hard G, hence the confusion. It's also interesting to note that he is far from the only Eurasian leader to have taken on a different name once in power. But whatever you call him, this video isn't really about him. Or rather, it's not focused on him, but on the institutions he founded. But to look at those institutions, we need to look at his life and motivations and those of his principal rivals. There was a critical juncture of history where he prevailed and imposed his institutional reform on the steppe, but it could have played out in three other ways. Temujin was the son of Yesige, the leader of the Taychiud clan of the Mongols. Yesige was one of the generals of Ong Khan, the leader of the important Khanates tribe, who ruled the steppe on behalf of the Jin dynasty of China. But Yesige died of poison when the relatives of his wife poisoned him, and Temujin grew up orphaned and powerless. In the meat-eating world of the Mongols, he was raised on herbs and onions, so great was his poverty. He was ruthless, killing his older brother Begter after having been bullied by him. He was enslaved for this murder by his own clan, but he escaped slavery and went to marry his beloved betrothed Borte, receiving a dowry of a sable coat. She was captured in a raid by the rival Merkit tribe, so Temujin went up to pray for 3 days at the holy mountain of Burkhan Khaldun, beseeching Tengri, the eternal blue sky, for help in his troubles. Coming down, he took that sable coat to the Ong Khan and presented it to him as a way to render loyalty to the man his dead father once served. This loyalty was repaid with an army to help young Temujin rescue Borte, and Temujin became a general of the Ong Khan like his father before him. The Ong Khan had a son, Sangum, who was jealous of Temujin from the very first. Sangum was raised in the stultifying ways of Chinese court ritual, a useless heir of a Chinese puppet. The Ong Khan had led the Khanates to supremacy on the steppe, and if Sangum had succeeded his father, his vacillations and weaknesses would have been the signal for the Chinese to switch their loyalties to the next up-and-coming tribe, likely the Merkit or Naiman. The Chinese long had a strategy of allying with weaker tribes against stronger tribes to pacify their borders with strategic genocide and inter-tribal hatreds that would prevent them from ever banding together to invade China. This was as horrifying and effective as it sounds, and had worked for 1,000 years ever since the Han dynasty had used it against the Huns. If Sangam had come to power, he would have been the latest pawn in this cycle, and the next 1,000 years in Central Asia might have looked like the last 1,000. But Sangam was too weak to press any real claim to power, and he died in the desert after his last followers abandoned him.
The other chief general of the Ong Khan besides Temujin was a fellow named Jamuka. He swore to be Temujin's Anda, a fictive brother of sorts, but the two were otherwise like oil and water. Temujin's humble upbringing taught him the value of loyalty and appreciation for the people at the bottom of society, and as he rose he remembered them and elevated new men chosen by merit and loyalty. This unnerved the traditional steppe aristocracy who got their places by birth alone, and they clustered around Jamuka. The two men broke for good when Jamuka tried to impose a relatively undignified shepherding role upon Temujin, upon which Temujin left their mutual camp and ended up bringing most of Jamuka's presumably lower-class followers with him.
Jamuka was of a different sort than Sangum. Temujin never debased himself by swearing andahood with Sangam, after all. Jamuka appears in the secret history as a worthy rival to Temujin, someone who had an animating ideology of his own. Jamuka, had he been triumphant, would have kept the patterns of steppe history like Sangam, but he would have been energetic and effective. If the Mongols had been led by a Jamuka Khan, there would have been an eruption out of the east like the Turks of 600 years ago or the Huns of 1,000. But like the Turks and the Huns, Jamuka's Mongols would have been restrained by the geography of Central Asia, scarcely breaking out of it as the next wave of westward steppe invasion was absorbed by the settled lands of Transoxiana. With the same aristocratic institutions as the Turks or Huns, we can guess at similar outcomes. There would have been one last way history could have gone. After the fall of Jamuka, the last of the holdout steppe tribes took refuge in the court of the Kara Kitai at Balasagun. This is going to require a lot of context, so bear with me. The word for China in many languages, including Russian, is derived from the word Kitai. Even Marco Polo referred to northern China as Cathay, because the dynasty to rule these parts before the Jin had been a nomadic steppe tribe called the Khitans. Kara is a Turco-Mongol word meaning variously black, in-law relative, and more importantly for our purposes here, west. When the Jin had conquered the Khitans, a remnant of their court had fled west to the oasis cities of the Tarim Basin. Guchlug was a Naiman holdout against Temujin who, after being taken in by Kara Kitai, deposed the Khan and assumed the throne himself. He was also a Nestorian Christian who permitted only Christianity and the long native Buddhism to exist in his realm. Oppressed Muslims, mostly but not exclusively of the merchant class, cried out to Genghis Khan for relief. And the one and only time in history this happened, the Mongols marched to cities in the Tarim Basin who threw their walls open to greet them as liberators, and the Kara Kitai Khanate fell. It is quite probable that the European myth of Prester John is rooted in the character of Guchlug. He is the only other figure in the secret history of the Mongols that seems to break as many molds as Genghis Khan. As the Tarim Basin was becoming more Muslim, and as it depended more and more on international trade to survive, he pushed back on both counts. If those institutional arrangements had endured, what we now call Xinjiang would have remained Buddhist or become Christian, and would have relied more on farming and less on trade for its economy, as the empire of Qin Shi Huangdi had when it overthrew its own merchant class. Had the Tarim Basin been Christian or Buddhist, it might have looked to the czars and commissars for protection from China as the Buddhist Mongols did, and modern borders might be shaped differently. But none of that happened, and those are institutional paths not taken. Instead, we got Genghis Khan and his Yasa, or constitution-like law code, because it was too ruthlessly effective to not prevail. The shamans of Tengri saw this and rallied to his banner. Rival leaders were slain and their tribes folded into this new Mongol nation. Once organizationally shorn of ancient ethnic hatreds, they were commanded of groups of 10 by people chosen by Genghis Khan for their military skill, who also armed them out of their own funds. These new conscripts were then paid incredibly well for their non-stop military service, knowing that even if they died, Genghis Khan's state would provide for their widows and orphans. Plunder of the conquered was ruthless and systematic, and paid for this new redistributionist barrack state. This was a good deal for the Mongols, and for any steppe nomads who could ride and shoot like Mongols. It served the merchants just fine, who had the protection of the Khan, the use of the military postal network, and the largest Eurasian free trade area in history in which to make money. It was more or less neutral to the artisans who kept making trade goods in cities just for different rulers. It was good to the clerics of minority faiths, who enjoyed the religious tolerance of the Mongols. It was less good for the clerics of majority faiths, who lost the power to persecute, but also gained tax exemptions that gave them broad power and practice. It was a pretty lousy deal for the commoners being plundered, who fled to better conditions as a result. In the Iranian Ilkhanate, they fled to India in such numbers that the Khan Ghazan could radically hike taxes and still get less money. In the Russian Golden Horde, they fled to the swamps to become Cossack nomads like the Mongols themselves, or to the protection of rural Orthodox monasteries where their labor would be untaxable. In the Chagatai Khanate of Central Asia, they were all either nomads or the recently settled descendants of Turkic nomads who had hailed the Mongols as liberators, so the hardships suffered by commoners here were fewer, and Genghis Khan's Yasa held with the least changes for the longest time. But in China, commoners rose in revolution. China was too populated and no amount of genocide could change that. There were no underground aquifers that could be destroyed to dry up the agriculture and drive the population to a manageable level, as the Mongols had done in Iran. There were not enough nomads to keep the Chinese people down forever, and they were being riled up by newly unemployed Confucian scholars angry about Tibetan Buddhist upstarts replacing them at court. This is not the only time Chinese people have been riled up against Tibetan Buddhists by a foreign hegemonic power, but when history rhymes, it usually means the same institutions are involved. But that's a story for a different day, Mr. Thandu. There was nothing Kublai Khan could do to affect the conquest of China in his lifetime other than to radically change the Yasa of Genghis Khan. The nomads that couldn't conquer and hold southern Chinese territory got paid scraps, and Chinese sailors and siege engineers that could got paid more. Confucian scholars were patronized with the money that change saved in order that they would tell their friends and family and followers to get behind Kublai, not as a Mongol Khan, but as a Chinese scholar emperor who would unify the land for the first time since the Tang dynasty. This unsettled the rest of the Mongols, who didn't like being demoted and decentered in a country their arms had seized. The result was the Mongol Civil War fought between Kublai Khan against Kaidu, leader of the Chagatai Khanate. The immediate result of the war was inconclusive, but nobody after Kublai could ever claim to lead a unified Mongol empire ever again. This is not the only time that a Eurasian politician facing a grave military threat chose instead to pursue reforms that splintered the international political alliance he led and undermined their strength in the long term. But when history rhymes, it usually means the same institutions are involved. But that's a story for a different day, Mr. Khrushchev. So did the Mongol Khans bless their realms, or what? It all gets down to the history of their institutions, and the central institution was the Yasa. While Genghis Khan's concern for the weak and downtrodden among his own people was new, exploitation itself was not. The scale of the atrocities and the exactions and the tribute was new, but that was only because Genghis Khan was more effective than his Hunnic and Turkic predecessors. Smaller crimes of a peace with the Mongols have gone unanswered for their sheer banality, but this is the first time someone seized power in a society and used that power for the good of everyone in it. Jamuka resisted Temujin in the same way that the wants of the rich always resist the needs of the poor. This wasn't just political, it wasn't even just personal, it was ideological. The overwhelming military and organizational power of the Mongols was not all-powerful, nor could it have endured forever. It failed in both directions before it reached the ocean, in Syria and Ainjalut, and off the coast of Japan twice. Any dispensation based on military power is always endangered by stronger enemies, as happened in China during Kublai's reign, and everywhere else by the advent of gunpowder. Organizationally, Genghis Khan allowed a great weakness into his Yasa by subjecting the succession to tanistry. This was a rare failure of imagination. By allowing the succession to be decided between his descendants by a vote of all Mongols, he guaranteed the empire would never get so big that its generals couldn't rush home to vote in their favorite Khan, and indeed that is what spared Europe. Perhaps he wanted to guarantee the throne to his children and the franchise to his subjects, but both could not be guaranteed for long. Indeed, as every legitimate contender for the throne had to come from his issue, Genghis Khan guaranteed bloody fratricide and ancient hatreds between his own descendants. What was conquered by one Khan would be divided away in a rebellion between his sons. Even if Genghis Khan had not intended for tanistry to arise, the centralized state he built would have demanded it anyway. If he who rules is all-powerful over dozens of lands, and he who doesn't is not, and there are a few gradations of power in between, then rival aspirants would have started a civil war anyway, be it for money, power, or ideology. A centralized state provides immense capacity to do both good and ill. If the Khan is wise, an empire can take root in a generation. If the Khan is greedy or misled, an empire can ebb away without anyone noticing. It all depends on who's Khan, which makes replacing that Khan too attractive for many to pass up, and it makes the Khan unwilling to compromise with people who likely plot his destruction. The political stakes are zero-sum for all players. This is why the Yasa, and the institutions that arose from it, foster war and revolution. One of the side effects of this militarism is that no country ruled by one of Genghis Khan's grandsons has ever been ruled since for more than a generation by a country that was not. Another way to put this, if you take a map of the world and cut out every country that was ever ruled by Westerners, you're left with Ethiopia, Japan, and the former Mongol Empire. War and revolution might be terrible, but getting to skip the business end of the white man's burden is a pretty sweet gift from Temujin to Eurasia. Furthermore, the guarantee of war and revolution is somewhat progressive in and of itself. It has often been that Western Europe has contented itself with false, unjust peace, as during the colonization of the world and the Munich Pact. Genghis Khan wouldn't stand for that, and neither would his ideological descendants. If war is won by the most effective, and the most effective is usually the side which the most people support, then it guarantees war until justice. If Western Europe's institutions had the only say in the matter, feudalism might have endured there forever. Genghis Khan brought the modern world's first mercantile empire instead, and Western Europe spent centuries catching up. The various totalitarianisms of Eurasia might seem like the opposite of human freedom, but a political meta-institution like the Yasa that incentivizes revolution when enough people aren't satisfied is in fact the ultimate guarantee of human freedom. Whenever the people of Europe grew quiet and accepted their fate, the nations of Eurasia would overturn the order of things and force everyone to start anew with fresh eyes. This is also why the countries once governed by the Yasa seem to grow at breakneck speed or stagnate. With a good Khan or Tsar or Commissar, the sky's the limit. Once upon a time, Soviet Russia posted growth rates comparable to China's today. That wasn't all propaganda, because they did beat us to space after all. But that growth sputtered and slowed with different leadership, and China's will likely do the same should different leadership come to power there. Furthermore, the structure of the Yasa helps guarantee development so long as the right ruler is in power by redistributing wealth to the bottom. As that wealth trickles back up, it creates demand that grows the economy. If the wise ruler party is not deposed, and if it does not hit a limit of foreign military power or resource depletion, it can grow like this indefinitely. The tragedy of Eurasia is the size of those ifs. This pattern of swift growth, following stagnation, first emerged in Chinese history, and like many other Chinese institutions, the Yasa spread it throughout Eurasia. Another Chinese institution spread by the Yasa was the bureaucratic state staffed by merit, and the notion of the ruler as a scholar at the head of that bureaucracy. Even communists played that type, because they in dynastic China both used the theories of their favored intelligentsia to support the legitimacy of the state. Other institutions the Mongols spread from China were the postal network and the census, and Western Europe had nothing comparable until the 19th century. So no outside colonization, better institutions than what came before, and their institutional descendants beat us to space? I'd say the Mongol Khans blessed every realm they conquered, so long as that realm kept the Yasa. Thanks for checking out this video. If you liked it, hit that subscribe button and share this video with your friends. If you can afford to, please support this on Patreon so I can continue giving away my history education on YouTube for free. You can even get some sweet perks if you do. Perpetrators... I'm sorry. I can't. The perpetrators of adorability, like Sakaki over there. Were the realms of the Mongols? Okay. Were the realms of the Mongols blessed by there being Khans over them? Huh? All right. Kill it.